Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So today I did want to talk about something. So I know there is this big thing happening in the YouTube chair community where someone is going from being New Age and Pagan and they're going to Christianity. I'm not going to be talking about that, but what I did want to do is basically something Kellyanne had mentioned in her reaction video to it, was that, when Christians go to New Age, they don't really do a testimonial, or they don't really, talk about switching from one to the other. And so I thought I would. So my experience with going from Christian to Pagan, New Age, growing up, we were a Christian family. We didn't go to church every Sunday or anything like that, but it was very well known in our family, and it was spoken of that, we believed in God, we believed in Jesus, and, that was it. And whenever we would talk about what type of Christianity we were, it was always Southern Baptist, right? Because, I grew up in, most of my life in a Southern state. And it was always talked about. But what always made me question was the fact that in my family, especially the women, in my family, there are women who have gifts, right? My great-grandmother, she had dreams, prophetic dreams. She read regular regular playing cards. She read coffee grounds, things like that. My grandmother, she had prophetic dreams. My mom, she had dreams, and then, those were the only things that they spoke of. But there was always gifts in my family, but whenever anyone would talk about these gifts or these talents, it was always, no matter if it was at the beginning or the end, it was always said that, these are from God, and that is it, and I'm going to use them, the way that He wants me to, and I never could quite wrap my mind around that. I know I've talked before in other videos about me being an empath and growing up and not really knowing what was going on and not really getting my questions answered in the way that was fulfilling to me, I guess you could say. It was always very much shoved down. I remember one very important, and looking back, this was one of those monumental moments that you don't really realize until days, months, years down the road, right? And I remember we were living with my grandmother at the time, and her bathroom, when you went in and you went to the back, there was a set of stairs that went to upstairs, and there was 2 rooms up there. And I remember being very young. I can't say as to what age I was, but I was no older than maybe 10, and my mom told me, to go in and take a bath, and get ready for bed. So I'm in the bathtub and I'm sitting there, doing what kids do, pretending to bathe when I probably wasn't. Kids are so gross. But I was sitting there and I started hearing these voices from upstairs. And it sounded like 2 young girls laughing and talking and gossiping, and in my mind, my immediate thought was, there's people up there, So I get out of the tub and I go to the door and I open it, and my mom is sitting out there, and I'm like, hey, I hear voices upstairs. And she turns and she looks at me and she says, you probably just left the TV on, it's fine, just go finish your bath. And I was like, okay. So I went back in, continued to take a bath, And I am still hearing these voices. And it wasn't continuous. It would be, laughs and giggles, and then it would go away and I would hear nothing. And then it would be really loud laughs and giggles, and I would catch words here and there. But it wasn't, continuous. And then I got scared. I got really scared. And because I didn't understand, because I knew that I did not leave the TV on up there. So I didn't understand why I was hearing these voices, and I didn't understand why my mom was being so dismissive of it. So I started crying, and I called my mom into the bathroom, and I said, I can hear these voices. There's someone up there. And she got very angry at me, and she told me that I needed to just ignore the voices, finish my bath, and she didn't have time, to deal with my imagination, is basically how she put it. And so I was very upset, and from then on I never really told anyone when weird things happened to me. Other people in the family would talk about weird experiences, but I would never talk about things, because that moment would always come back to me, where my mom had gotten so angry at me for saying, that I was hearing these voices. And looking back now, it was probably, she was probably just as terrified or scared as I was, having your daughter come up to you and say, that they're hearing these voices. And yeah, so I mean, looking back now, but then it was a very traumatic experience, and it stuck with me. So I never really, after that, spoke about the experiences I was having and what I was feeling, because at the time I was an empath. I was feeling all of these feelings, and I was feeling much more deeply than anyone around me was. And I didn't understand, but I didn't talk to anybody about it, hardly ever. And when I did, it was kind of brushed aside and not really talked about. Kind of how, if a child goes to an adult and the adult just never really takes them seriously, right? I was just never taken seriously. And so I learned to just not talk about these things. And I kept them to myself. And that went on for years. And I lived in this basically this in-between space of knowing I was different, but not acknowledging that I was different. So I was in this in-between space where I knew I was different, but I completely ignored it. And I just kind of floated there. And over the years, my mom, my grandma, things like that, they would talk about dreams. My mom would have dreams, and she would know if someone in the family, was going to pass away. My grandmother would have dreams, and she would know if someone was pregnant in the, just things like that, right? And what bothered me was they were able to talk about these things, but I never was. And I didn't understand how they were allowed to, but I wasn't. And how when I talked about it, it was brushed aside. But when they talked about it, people listened, right? And so I went through that years. Fast forward to I'm in high school, and this is the early 2000s. New Age was kind of becoming a little bit mainstream. It was becoming a little well known, and I got interested. I was like, well, I mean, if I'm not getting my answers over here, then I might as well look over here too, right? And I dabbled for a little bit, not a lot. I read books or, did this or that, but it wasn't anything serious. Well, then my sister bought a deck of tarot cards, and I was immediately fascinated. I wanted to know everything. I loved when she would get them out and she would play with them, and and I've talked about this too, I still have that deck. She would play with them, and I was immediately drawn. I was immediately fascinated. But this whole time it was still, I'm a Christian, right? And Then fast forward a few more years, and in between then, my sister, she lost interest in, but the tarot cards, she gave them to me. I begged her, to give them to me. Then I got them, and that was like my first little piece of like new age. It was a connection. It was mine. Fast forward to college, I go away to college, and I meet like-minded people who had grown up in these like Southern Christian households, who just felt unsatisfied with what they were hearing, and like what they were like learning. And so we dove in, man. Like, we dove in hard, and it was exhilarating, and it was fascinating, because I was learning things that, there were other things out there. There were other ways, to practice spirituality, and there were all of these options, and yeah, like you had to make your choice of, going this way or going that way. But it was so inspiring because I finally had a choice. When before it was this way or no way, now I had all of these options. It was like I was standing in this road, and there was just like so many different paths in front of me, and it was fascinating. And I learned about empathy, and finally, for the first time, realized what was happening to me, and like what had always been happening. And it was just like, at one point, it was just like a huge just that things were finally being talked about, and things were finally being discussed, and I was finding out things about myself that I was never able to before. But still, instead of just saying I was New Age and I was pagan, I went the route of Christio-pagan. I'm still a Christian, but I'm dabbling in this, right? I'm still a Christian, but I still want to know about this stuff. And I feel like Christio-paganism was just like an easier like bridging of what I had been like around my whole life, and what I wanted to believe and practice. And at the time, that's what I needed, because I didn't have the the strength or the fortitude to just completely say, I no longer believe in this, but this is what I want to do. And we all did it, me and all of my friends, 2-3 of whom I'm still friends with now, but and I still practice with, Salt being one of them. But it was just like I didn't have that strength to do that, and that strength still wouldn't come until quite a few years later. But that was my bridge, Christio-paganism, and I really enjoyed it. I loved it because it made me comfortable with finding the new. I think if I hadn't of gone the Christio-pagan like segue, I may not have been able, or would have let myself explore as much as I did. And we did, man. We explored like crazy. We read books, and we played with tarot cards, and we meditate. I mean, it was every day. Every day after our classes, we would come back and we would practice, and it was amazing. And I remember at one point, and again, this was one of those moments in my life, and I remember being home for the weekend, and I was sitting at our kitchen table, and my mom was cooking at the stove, and I remember thinking in my mind, I'm like, I need to tell her, because before I had pretty much told Mom everything. Except for, being younger, not really understanding, my empathy and things like that. But other than that, I had pretty much told Mom everything. And so I remember sitting there, and I'm terrified. I'm terrified that she's going to look at me and she's going to be so angry. And I remember sitting there, and it got to the point where I just blurted out and I was like, "Hey Mom, I have something to tell you." And she's, stirring her pots at the stove, and she kind of glances over her shoulder and she's like, "Yeah, well, yeah, what's going on?" And I looked at her and I said, "I'm not completely Christian anymore." And I remember she stopped stirring, and then she turned and she looked at me and she said, "Well, what do you mean?" I said, "Well, I'm Christio-pagan." I was like, I still believe in Christianity, but I just practice it, in a pagan way. She paused for a second, she looked at me and she said, "Well, do you still believe in God?" And I immediately said, "Yes. Yeah, yes, I do. Yes, yes, yes." And Mom was fine with it. She said, "Well, as long as you still believe in God and Jesus and you still have, but that relationship, I'm fine with it." Even though in my mind, even when I said yes, I didn't. And that moment is what would later, because, of course, at the time you don't realize, it's that significant, but that moment would later push me to admit, that I didn't believe in God anymore. And, I didn't want to be on this weird in between, that yeah, it was comfortable for a time, but eventually it got to be super uncomfortable, and it got to be like this band-aid that I put over this this thing that I didn't want people to see, I was only showing part of myself, yeah, I'm pagan, but I'm Christio-pagan, I'm still part Christian. It's fine, it's fine, it's fine. And it got to the point where this band-aid became unbearable, and to myself and to, my closest friends, I was like, I don't want to be this anymore. I'm not Christio-pagan, I'm pagan. I don't believe in Christianity at all. And that was that for me. In that moment was very uplifting, and it was amazing. But I still hadn't actually except for, to myself and, my friends and to my husband, I hadn't really come out and said, "Hey, I'm a witch, I'm a pagan." And eventually I did. There are still, some family members who I don't really have that much contact with. They basically just see my social media accounts and things like that. That, I'm 30 years old. And a few years ago, I realized, I'm a grown-ass woman. I can believe what I want to believe. And my family is either going to, accept me and be okay with it, or they're not, and I'm okay with that. I'm okay with walking a different path than most of my family. I'm okay with making people uncomfortable, because this is the path for me. This is the path that I've chosen to walk, and this is a path that makes me feel alive, and it invigorates me, and it makes me whole, and thinking of going back to Christianity, I almost have a physical reaction to it, because it would be having, to me, paganism is having all of these books and all of these things to explore and all of these options, but Christianity would be having one book, well, literally one book for the rest of my life, and I just read it over and over and over again, and that's just not for me. It's not for me. And this is where I'm at now. I'm happy, I'm comfortable, I work with deity, I can easily say I'm a green witch, I can easily say those things, and I'm so happy that I can. So that is basically my journey from growing up Christian to Christo-Pagan to being pagan. Yeah, so I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you learned a little bit more about me. But much love, blessings, and growth, and I will see you next time.